night of June 5, 1944. Normandy's coastline slept under a layer of mist and tension. German soldiers of the 7th Army lay restless inside concrete bunkers along what Berlin called the Atlantic Wall, its grand illusion of invulnerability. For 3 years, they had been told this network of fortified positions would repel any invasion. Steel and sandbags stretched from the Pyrenees to the North Sea, and beneath every command plaque stood the promise of Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. But tonight, inside those bunkers, men felt something that defied doctrine, silence that felt alive. Private Ernst Heller, on watch near Omaha Beach, scanned the sea with field glasses. The wind carried the smell of salt and diesel. Around him, fortifications hummed with routine discipline. Kriegsmarine spotlights faintly searching the horizon, radio operators checking frequencies that had been quiet for weeks. Somewhere in the darkness, unknown waves moved toward them. Far above, General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel had already returned to Germany to visit his wife. At higher headquarters in Paris, von Rundstedt and his staff awaited orders from Hitler, who was asleep at the Berghof in Bavaria. No one in command was on the ground. Instead, the Atlantic Wall was manned by tired conscripts and Ost battalions filled with Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians, foreigners in German uniform. They watched the sea, not for glory, but because it was their job. Around 02 on June 6th, radar operators at Cherbourg picked up the first echoes, blips so dense they looked like a storm front. Reports flashed through the defensive network to the 7th Army HQ. General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, was awakened by a phone call from his adjutant. The channel was filled with ships, hundreds of them. He suspected a raid, but no one believed it was the invasion itself. Hitler had insisted the main landing would be near Pas-de-Calais. Normandy was considered a feint. At 4:30 the guns began. From the sky and sea came noise beyond imagination. Naval salvos covered the beaches with flame and earth. Dawn revealed the truth. The entire horizon was alive with ships, destroyers, cruisers, transports, and landing craft beyond count. To those inside the bunkers, it looked like the ocean had grown teeth. Heller remembered his commander whispering, "Das ist nicht mehr Krieg, das ist das Ende." This is no longer war. This is the end. The invasion the Germans had planned for, but never believed possible, had come. By first light, at least 156,000 Allied troops were crossing the beaches at 5 points: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Against them, in the Normandy region, stood roughly 50,000 German troops spread thin across 70 miles of coast. Their radios crackled, orders conflicted, and in those chaotic hours, the men of the Wehrmacht fought alone, with no clear direction, no reinforcements, and no hope of air cover. At 06, as the first Higgins boats grounded against Omaha, the automatic guns of Widerstands Nest 62 opened fire. Machine guns chopped through the air in long rhythmic bursts, hitting cliffs and sand indiscriminately. To the German gunners inside, it felt not like battle but avalanche, shadows appearing in thousands where minutes before there had been empty sea. They fired, reloaded, fired again. Their barrels glowed red. The defenders could hear their own heartbeats inside the helmets. By 7:30, American Rangers were climbing Pointe du Hoc. The 712th Battery defended that sector, its men barely 20. When they saw Allied ropes dangling from the cliffs, they cut them down with rifle fire and grenades. For an hour they held, then the naval shells came closer. Each explosion lifted the earth and erased the living. Out of 11 guns, only 2 remained. One sergeant wrote, "We did not see soldiers. We saw waves of figures too many to kill." On Sword Beach, the 21st Panzer Division attempted the only organized counterattack of D-Day. Colonel Hans von Luck led the advance toward the British sectors near Seine, hoping to reach the coast before the bridgehead solidified. His panzers moved at speed, crossing hedgerows under constant fire from Typhoon and Spitfire bombers. By noon they had decimated British positions, but saw a dark line of wave tops, and recognition came late. The entire shore from Ouistreham to Luc-sur-Mer was already lost. Noon on June 6th was the moment Germany's Western Front was irrevocably broken. The Wehrmacht's radio logs record crisis codes blaring from every sector. Feind gelandet, enemy landed. Commanders pleaded for air support that never arrived. Rommel's panzer reserves, kept too far inland, could not move under the swarm of Allied fighter bombers that darkened the roads. When night fell, the Germans still held a narrow strip of beach, but the sky and sea had turned against them. For those defending Normandy, June 6th didn't feel like a battle to win. It felt like a storm to survive. By 7 a.m. on June 6, 1944, gunfire had swallowed the beaches, but at German headquarters, disbelief still reigned. Reports arrived from Normandy describing enemy landings in battalion strength. To the field staff of Army Group B, that phrase suggested a limited raid, perhaps another Dieppe. To Hitler's generals, trained to see the Calais sector as the true invasion point, it was impossible to imagine that the Anglo-Americans would risk their main blow so far west. At Saint-Germain-en-Laye outside Paris, Field Marshal von Rundstedt's operators worked furiously over telephones that connected to OB West's dispersed command network. Messages arrived like shrapnel, one division overwhelmed at Courcelles, another line broken south of Carentan. Rundstedt asked for release of the Panzer Reserves, those armored divisions grouped as Panzer Group West under General Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg. Each tank division was within a day's march of the coast, if they could move. But the if was deadly. Luftwaffe reconnaissance was grounded. Bridges lay busted by night raiders. Even messenger motorcycles struggled through convoys of refugees clogging Normandy's lanes. And the most crushing delay was political. No order of movement could be issued without the Führer's explicit authorization. Hitler slept on, guarded by aides too afraid to wake him for rumors of a landing. Those hours were fatal. By the time he stirred at around 10 a.m., 3 armies had already pierced the Atlantic Wall. While Berlin debated, men bled. The 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha inflicted terrible casualties, but was too thinly spread to contain the tide. Communications cut, officers died in their bunkers, still sending orders to units that no longer existed. In the German report later captured by the Allies, the first line read, "Enemy achieved complete mastery of the air. Our movement in daylight impossible." That sentence summed up the day. By mid-morning, Rommel was back on the road from Germany. His car raced north as news mounted. American divisions at Utah and Omaha, Brits and Canadians at Gold, Juno, Sword, and thousands of paratroopers behind them. The sky he drove beneath carried armadas of transport planes, each casting shadows like a plague of locusts. When he finally reached La Roche-Guyon that evening, he found his division logs a mess of desperate telegrams. "Fuel shortages limit all movement," one said. Another, "Air attacks continue without pause." Rommel sighed. "The war in the West," he told his aides, "has begun in earnest, and we have already lost it." But on the ground, the men did what their creed demanded: hold fast. Within Widerstands Nest 64 at Omaha, Sergeant Karl Wagner kept up fire for 6 hours until his MG-42's barrel melted and his squad was down to knives and grenades. At Seine, the 21st Panzer Division under Feuchtinger did the unthinkable, a counterattack. Its commander, Colonel Oppeln Bronikowski, ordered panzers toward Benny-sur-Mer and the Orne. Mark IVs and self-propelled guns rumbled forward behind a screen of wiry infantry. For a few glorious hours, German armor reclaimed its old swagger. They even reached the sea. Only then did they realize their flank was gone, the entire coast south of Ouistreham held by Allied guns. When naval fire rained down, their victory evaporated in spray and smoke. Night brought no reprieve. Above, Allied gliders delivered more paratroopers, each landing a nail in the coffin of German control. To the German soldiers watching from their bunkers, it looked as if the heavens themselves had opened. On some sectors, the dead lay in lines so dense that telephone wires were strung over the bodies to keep communications running. Inside the command bunker of the 352nd, an aide wrote in his diary, "We were not defeated for lack of courage, but for lack of horizon. You cannot fight the sky." The day after the landings, the smoke refused to clear. Rommel and Rundstedt pleaded with Hitler to authorize a broad withdrawal toward defensive lines around the Seine. Hitler refused. June 7th became a day of repetition, counterattacks met by air obliteration. Allied fighter bombers turned every road into a death trap. German truck drivers learned to dread the whine of Typhoon rockets, that feral screech preceding a curtain of fire. Panzer Group West, Rommel's supposed sledgehammer, deployed piecemeal through bottlenecks. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, fanatic and fresh, hurled itself into British lines near Seine on June 8th. For 10 days they held against artillery and Spitfire strafe runs, losing half their men but stalling the Allied advance. Erich Marks, commander of 84th Corps, told Colonel Bronikowski before sending him back into battle, "If you don't throw them into the sea today, we shall have lost the war." He was right, and he was killed the next morning by a Typhoon rocket. By late June, German reinforcements were trickling in from Brittany and the Pas de Calais, but each journey was a gauntlet. Fuel shortages bit harder than enemy fire. Columns hid under trees, moving at night like ghosts. Many men never reached Normandy at all. Their vehicles burned in ditches before they ever saw the enemy. Through July, the fight for Caen turned Normandy's hedgerow country into a medieval labyrinth of fire. British operations Epsom and Charnwood met stubborn defense, but each German victory was hollow. Airfields and fuel depots vanished daily under bombing. Rommel observed grimly, "It is no longer possible to move by day." He would soon be wounded in his car by Spitfire bullets, and by July 17th, he was out of the war. By August, von Kluge replaced him and stood amid a nightmare, what the Wehrmacht called Die Schlacht um Normandie. Panzer divisions were down to a handful of tanks. The 1st SS Leibstandarte, once elite, had 40 machines left out of 300. The 21st Panzer Division was destroyed. And when the Allies broke out at Saint-Lô and Avranches in Operation Cobra, there was nothing strong enough to stop them. Falaise became a graveyard of steel, German forces trapped in a crescent of bombardment. 2,000 tanks were committed to Normandy. Fewer than 70 remained working by August 27th. Inside German command diaries after the battle, one officer wrote a question that no one could answer. At what point does duty become surrender to impossibility? The answer was Falaise. More than 200,000 men were killed, captured, or missing. Seen through German eyes, D-Day was not simply defeat. It was the collapse of faith in the very idea of invincibility. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's symbol of endurance, proved a mirage. Beneath the propaganda, ordinary soldiers had faced a mathematical truth: 5-1 in men, 10-1 in tanks, and absolute dominion in the air. No field courage could equal that equation. Ernst Heller survived Omaha and was captured outside Saint-Lô. Years later, he told an interviewer, "We were ordinary men fighting a myth we had helped to build. When I saw their planes, I understood for the first time that we had lost before we began." His words summed up the Wehrmacht's final Europe moment, when discipline met industrial destiny and shattered. By September 1944, the Allies stood on the Seine. Paris had fallen. The men of the 7th Army who had once guarded Normandy now marched into captivity, singing old songs to prove they could still be soldiers, if not winners. The German army in France had been scoured out, 290,000 casualties, 23,000 dead, 67,000 wounded, 200,000 captured. The war would rage for 8 more months, but Europe's fate was sealed in the sand of Normandy. Rommel's final memoir entry, written weeks before his death, reads almost like a eulogy for Germany itself. "I fought brave men on both sides, but the machine was stronger than the man, and the machine was American." D-Day from the German perspective remains a tale not of cowardice or incompetence, but of inevitability. It is a story of soldiers who did their duty to the end, standing in the shadow of a world already decided by production lines, fuel stocks, and air supremacy. Their defeat did not begin on the beaches. It began in the skies, in the factories, and in the fatal belief that walls could hold against storms. The silence that followed was not peace, only the sound of history turning its page.